Engineers are one of the most important behind-the-scenes groups of people, and most of us just take them and their work rather for granted. The truth is that there can only be so many designers, and the vast majority of engineers do the unglamorous but no less important work of building, testing, and improving things for safety and to make sure that nobody gets hurt and nobody has to pay for large amounts of property damage. However, when you don't hire enough skilled engineers to properly focus on safety and do, all of that important work that they do, you can end up with examples like the 10 that we're looking at in today's video. Number 10. The Deepwater Horizon disaster gushed 130 million tons of oil right into the ocean. Back in 2010, BP's Deepwater oil rig, operated by the Switzerland-based company Transocean Limited, suffered a massive blowout, and the world watched in shock and horror. 11 people died and 17 were injured in the initial blowout, and immediately people wanted to know how it had happened. But soon, something even more important became apparent. Due to the fact that the well was 35,055 feet underwater, which was far deeper than any well in existence and the only one that was in truly deep water, the oil that started leaking out quickly became a huge concern. For years, BP and Transocean had contended to regulators that their oil rig was fine because they were prepared for cleanup, but all they had were the same techniques that worked in shallow water. No company, BP or otherwise, had any real plan for how to stop a gushing oil leak coming out of the ocean floor in really deep water. BP took 87 days before they managed to plug the leak, and during that time an estimated 130 million gallons of oil leaked into the Gulf of Mexico, with the Audubon Society estimating that a good 1 million birds and other marine life were killed by the spill. As for how it occurred, it turned out there wasn't a single reason that the oil rig suffered a blowout. It was caused by multiple failures that could have been prevented in time if not for lax regulators and a lax company culture from both BP and Transocean. Number 9. Earthquakes may have damaged the Fukushima reactors long before the tsunami. Most people know that there was a meltdown at the Fukushima nuclear power plant after a tsunami several years back, but many people don't know the official story, or at least what some suspect is the true cause. The official story is that an earthquake knocked out the power to the plant, but apart from that, it left the plant largely unharmed and functioning just fine. In fact, according to this official story, the plant only failed when the tsunami came along and destroyed their backup generators, after which the plant's cooling system stopped working and the meltdown occurred. However, investigative reporters who interviewed workers that had been at the plant when the earthquake occurred offered a version of events that differs a bit from that of the Japanese government. Many of them claim that they saw significant damage to pipes, some of which led to cooling systems for the reactors. Others saw serious structural damage or other issues and claimed that they were already told to evacuate because of oxygen tanks exploding and pipes bursting well before the tsunami hit. Then, as they were leaving, the tsunami warning came and they had to go to the top of the building to wait to be rescued. While the government version of events calls into question the safety of a reactor near the coast due to the possibility of a tsunami, the second version of events calls into question any reactor of a similar design that is in any kind of earthquake zone at all. Number 8. The Challenger disaster was caused by an O-ring, but only because of poor decisions. On January 8, 1986, the Space Shuttle Challenger was set to launch, and it was going to be a truly epic affair. A schoolteacher had been chosen to join the 6 astronauts in order to show that even normal civilians could go into space, and children around the country were watching the launch from their classrooms on that cold Tuesday morning. Unfortunately, the festive atmosphere, it soon turned tragic as the shuttle exploded before reaching the upper atmosphere, killing all 7 people on board. The Secretary of State at the time, William P. Rogers, formed a commission to find the root cause. They quickly found that the technical cause was a faulty O-ring. This small piece of plastic helped form seals in between parts of the rocket boosters and doesn't operate well in cold environments. In those environments, it loses its elasticity. In fact, the Commission found that despite knowing the O-ring didn't function well below 53 degrees, they went ahead with the launch despite it being 36 degrees outside that morning. The Commission found that there were concerns about the O-rings, but they never reached the top of the chain of command. This is believed to have been due to incredibly poor communication, and that the top brass were desperate to get their launch done in time for Reagan's State of the Union. Therefore, they weren't particularly interested in learning about potential last-minute problems that would delay the launch. Number 7. The Columbia disaster could have potentially been avoided as well. The Columbia was a storied space shuttle that had been flying for decades and was set for its final mission. After many delays, it took off with a crew of 7 on January 16, 2003. As the shuttle was launching, a piece of foam insulation broke off from the propellant tank and hit the left wing. Engineers at NASA tried to look at it with every camera angle they could and see how bad the damage was, but it was hard to make it out. Now, NASA's top management was not particularly concerned, as foam insulation had broken off at 3 launches in the past and it hadn't caused any critical damage. However, some felt that this time it might be critical and pushed to get satellites to take a closer look. Unfortunately, no one took that look during the Columbia's 2-week mission, partly because some of the top brass felt there would be nothing they could do at all at that point, even if critical damage had occurred. Then, on February 1, 2003, the space shuttle re-entered Earth's atmosphere and broke apart, killing all on board and scattering debris far into the distance. The damage to the wing allowed the heat from re-entry, along with the winds, to basically tear it apart, and after that, the rest of the shuttle it wasn't far behind. While those in charge had decided to do nothing while the crew was in space, thinking nothing could be done, they were wrong. Later studies found that rescue, or even a possible repair via a spacewalk, could have been done. NASA's top management, they just didn't take the danger that seriously. Number 6. The Apollo 1 fire almost put an early end to US ambitions to fly to the moon. On January 27, 1967, NASA was testing their Apollo 1 command module in advance of attempting a potential flight to the moon. There were 3 astronauts on board, Roger Chaffee, Ed White, and Gus Grissom, and they were bolted into the pressurized compartment to begin their launch tests. While the tests were not proceeding particularly well and they were having technical issues, things were not anything beyond frustrating until the call of flames came over the communications equipment from inside the command module. The workers outside did everything they could to get the door open, but by the time they did, it was too late and all 3 astronauts were dead. The Apollo program was then shelved for 18 months while the situation was investigated. The United States, they lost 3 pioneering astronauts that day, but at least NASA did learn something from the situation. It turns out that a single spark from a faulty piece of equipment had spread like wildfire in the all-oxygen environment of the cabin, and to make matters worse, most of the material they were sitting on and around was highly flammable. On top of that, the highly secured door usually took a good minute and a half to open at the best of times, and with the extra pressure in the air from the fire, they just really didn't have a chance. Now, this is something NASA should have accounted for, but in future versions, they made doors which were quicker to open, they replaced the flammable materials, and they made the air an oxygen and nitrogen mix that would not so easily spread fire. Number 5. The Boeing 737 MAX crashes and the subsequent scandal are harming Boeing's reputation. On October 28, 2018, Lion Air Flight 610 went down over the Java Sea. It was carrying a full load of passengers, 181, and 8 crew members, who all perished. Then, on March 10, 2019, Ethiopia Airlines Flight 302 crashed and took 149 passengers and 8 crew members with it. While plane crashes are always alarming, experts noticed that there were similarities between the 2 crashes and that both involved the new Boeing 737 MAX jet. The system that allegedly caused all the trouble was called Maneuvering Characteristics Augmentation Systems, or MCAS for short. The system used 2 sensors to determine the nose of the plane's so-called angle of attack and adjust it if it thought it was necessary, even if the pilot disagrees. On the Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302, the black box showed that the plane was dangerously changing the angle of attack, and despite the pilot and co-pilot's constant and best efforts, they could not prevent an uncontrollable nosedive. Boeing has been under fire because regulators around the world allege that the system did not have enough redundancy to spot malfunctions, and that pilots were not given proper knowledge of it or proper training for it, and that the limited information they did give on how to deal with a malfunction was used by the pilot and co-pilot in the Ethiopian Airlines crash, and it still did not save them. Due to the loss in reputation, Boeing has had to scale back production to 42 jets from 52, and the 737 MAX remains grounded worldwide until Boeing satisfies people's fears. Number 4. The Chernobyl disaster was caused by a poorly done safety test and inadequate design. The Chernobyl disaster occurred on April 26, 1986, when Soviet engineers were doing a test on the number 4 reactor of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in order to ascertain if the emergency water pumps could run on inertial power. In order to prepare for their tests, they actually disabled the emergency safety systems of the reactor the night before. They also removed quite a few of the control rods for the reactor as well, which are used to control power output. When their experiment didn't work and they started to worry about meltdown, they reinserted all 200 control rods at once, which turned out to be a fatal mistake. The rods had graphite tips, which, when inserted under already volatile circumstances, caused a chemical reaction that blew the concrete and steel roof right off the reactor. The disaster killed 2 people immediately, and at least 28 workers later succumbed to radiation poisoning. The fallout is said to have poisoned thousands, and it led the entire world to put a lot more thought and effort into nuclear safety. The disaster was such a gigantic blow to the Soviet Union that Mikhail Gorbachev later lamented that it may have been Chernobyl that truly led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. Number 3. The Grenfell Tower fire highlighted the possibility of future similar tragedies. On June 14, 2017, a fire rapidly spread through Grenfell Tower in West London. By the time the smoke had cleared, upwards of 80 people had died and dozens more were injured. The tragedy became global news, and the entire world looked on in horror as we all watched the building burn before our eyes. It was quickly discovered that the reason the fire was able to spread so rapidly was due to a cladding on the outside of the building, which was there to both spruce up the design and also slightly increase its energy efficiency. Now, this cladding is usually aluminium, and it has some kind of special filler inside, and those fillers, they could be fire retardant. Unfortunately, the filler in the cladding at Grenfell Tower was highly flammable, and the fire quickly raced all around the building. After the tragedy, authorities in London have now inspected a lot of buildings that have cladding and found that most of them, they failed safety tests. This highlights a serious public safety concern, as it means that there are many, many more buildings at risk of fires simply raging out of control. Number 2. The Hyatt Regency Hotel Walkway collapse killed 114 people and injured another 216. On July 17, 1981, there was a tea dance at the Hyatt Regency Hotel in Kansas City, and the ballroom was hosting around 1,600 people. The hotel had 4 floors and upper walkways that extended across the main lobby area. The 4th floor walkway was positioned above the 2nd floor walkway, and a couple of dozen or so people were watching the dance from the walkways above the lobby. Then, seemingly out of nowhere, the 4th floor walkway collapsed onto the 2nd floor walkway, which then collapsed into the whole pile of dancing couples below. The aftermath, it was utterly appalling, and rescue workers likened it to a war zone. 114 people were killed and 216 were injured. Many of them, they were crushed, and others were suffocated or dealt with awful injuries. Unsurprisingly, there was an inquest into the matter, as people wanted to know why such a catastrophic failure had happened. The issue was the 2nd floor walkway had originally been intended to be suspended from the stronger ceiling supports, but was instead suspended from the 4th floor walkway. As for how such a bad decision could be made, the change was approved over the phone. Number 1. The Great Boston Molasses Flood of 1919 killed 21 people and injured 150 more. If you haven't heard of this tragic story before, it'll likely sound too bizarre to be true. On January 15, 1919, a tank filled with 2.3 million gallons of molasses ruptured in Boston's North End. Sources say that its initial speed was 35 miles an hour and that reached a wave height of 25 feet and was 160 feet wide. 21 people were killed and 150 more were injured by the time the molasses had settled. Many who were close to the explosion were simply pulverized, and others drowned in the goop as the kinetic forces dissipated and it turned back into its highly viscous consistency. Back in the day, they were never really sure what happened, but recent investigations have discovered that the tank was almost certainly just not adequate for the job. It was too thin, and while built to hold 2.5 million gallons of liquids, it wasn't designed for a thicker liquid that might weigh more, like molasses, and had even shown signs of cracks that were ignored by the owners and operators of the tank. Some even say that it was leaking so badly before it burst that children would come and fill cups with molasses. This just goes to show that sometimes, on rare occasions, molasses are not actually slow. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below. Also, don't forget to subscribe. And if you're looking for more, why not check out my other channel called Biographics? You will find that linked to below. And as always, thank you for watching.